Excellent. A couple of seconds here. All right, looks like we are live.
Live, okay. We'll go from here. Thank you. Thank you, Bobby.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Marlo, welcome. It's wonderful to have you. First live podcast, so this should be a lot of fun.
I like being experimental.
Very good, very good. So I always think it's fun to remind people of how you and I met, which is a funny story. So I taught a workshop for Apex Movement, and you were also teaching a workshop for Apex Movement, I believe, same week.
Possibly. The pole dance studio used to be located inside of the Parkour gym. So that's probably how that came about.
Okay, so I remember that. And then we were both invited to stay and do the Apex Movement teacher certification. And as part of that, you got everybody twerking, which was, I think, I don't know, maybe that's a precedent in the parkour community. The first twerking warm-up for parkour athletes as part of a parkour certification.
Yeah, I was asked, hey, can you get the group warm however you want? And for me, nothing gets people started for the day quite like landing in your pelvis. So yeah, it was a group of 30 men. And for many of them, maybe it seemed like the first time ever that I had them to get in a squat and do pelvic isolations, but it was a great hit.
It was. Yeah, we had a lot of fun. That's great. So I was remembering that I was just really in the beginning formation of what Evolve Move Play was around that time. And I had dug deep into the martial arts and the parkour, I did gymnastics and strength training. And I was looking at kind of the evolutionary origins, the cross-cultural lens on human movement. And the one area that felt like a big missing piece for me to understand was dance. And so I reached out to you and to our friend Shira Yaziv, and sort of like, you guys were my experts on trying to understand dance so that I could bring it into the conceptualization of Evolve Move Play. And I remember when I reached out to you, and I was like, you basically said I was already a dancer. And Shira said the same thing. So that was not my self-conception, right? I thought of myself as a pretty big, awkward, funky mover. Someone very much without rhythm, had been accused of being extraordinarily white multiple times in my life. And so I was curious if we could start there. Like, why is it that you told me when I first came to speak to you about dance that I was already a dancer?
Because the belief that you are not a dancer is the biggest impediment to you dancing.
Mm-hmm.
To the distinction of what to be dancing or what is dance and what is not dance, I tend to discourage people from even going there or qualifying. I am a dancer, I am not a dancer, and rather looking at the things that we already are doing and starting to experience it as a dancer. What is experiencing it as a dancer? That's paying attention to what you're feeling, paying attention to how you're moving, and welcoming outside influence. If there's something environmental, like music is an outside influence, that could be an environmental influence or the place that you're in. And in allowing yourself to follow moment to moment impulses. Like if you when something comes up, whether it be a sensation, oh wow, I'm feeling stiff in this area, to like welcome moving into it and exploring it. Those are all, you could consider those acts of dance. And I think that people tend to qualify themselves as, I am not a dancer because I perceive a dance as this particular thing. A dancer must have these particular qualities. I don't have those qualities. And really that belief upholds the distinction between who is a dancer and who is not a dancer. Do we allow to dance? Who do we not allow to dance? Who do we want to see moving and who do we not want to see moving? And like upholding those beliefs about like, I am not a dancer. It's not just doing ourselves a disservice. It does a disservice to other people too. I think that generally most of us want people to feel at home in their body and feel more relaxed and feel free. So one of the greatest things that we can all do is be like, screw it. Yeah. All right. I'm a dancer. Here goes. I'm just going to move. I'm just going to get started moving. So that is why I said, no, you already are.
I've been thinking a lot about this idea that one of the things that happens within capitalism, let's say, and I love capitalism in certain ways, and I also think that it is contrary to human well-being in other ways, and we need to work to balance that out. But one thing that it does is it really encourages us to lean into whatever we have a market advantage doing, and to do that to the exclusion of everything else. And so people become more and more specialized into a little niche. And that niche can be very economically productive, but it can be very limiting of the development of the self. And so we've moved from a world where dance is something that you do as part of a social world that you're engaged in, to dance is something that you consume through watching other people do it. And same with singing, same with cooking. I literally think people are moving more towards not even having sex themselves and just watching the professionals do it. Something like 30% of men under the age of 30 have not had sex in the last year, according to the most recent statistics.
Well, was that this year or another year?
It was 2018. But yeah, it's like we're more and more disconnected from these things. And I was thinking about it. It's like there are professions, right? Like you'd be a professional speaker, right? But nobody would say I'm not a speaker. I mean, I speak. Obviously, I speak, and I think everybody has danced, right? But we forget that. So I'm curious to hear you talk about why do you think that dance has become so intimidating for people to be open to?
Partially attributed to one of the forces you mentioned at the beginning when you said capitalism, colonialism. I think that, am I breaking up?
No, you sound good to me.
Okay, you were frozen, sorry. But capitalism, colonialism, organized religion, these are all forces that removed people from their relationship, their embedded relationship with music and dance and song. Sometimes forcibly, right? Oftentimes forcibly. So those forces over time, like really took away many people's relationship, whether it was their own cultural heritage relationship with music, if people are displaced from because dance and music are, even in a number of African cultures, they're not distinguished as separate words. Like dance and music and song, like it's all something that occurs together. It occurs like harmoniously, and it's not something to be separated and removed or like, in some ways appropriated, the one trait. Oh, I would like to take the movement from this thing, but not experience my body in rhythm, with music, in sound, in community. So there are these global forces that contributed to many of us not having grown up with a deep relationship to rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not too sure if I've answered the question, but it was, you were pointing to why are we disconnected from dance?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's interesting about you and your approach is I think that you're really passionate about trying to lower those barriers, right? Trying to help people recover dance as something that is available to them and potentially valuable and transformational, whether they have the potential to be professional in it or not, or, super highly skilled or not. So can you tell us a little bit about how you break those barriers down and why that's important to you?
Mm-hmm. It's important to me because it feels tragic. It feels like a huge tragedy that people maybe go through their life and don't experience the joy of moving their body rhythmically and without worry about what other people think of them. Like that, to go through your whole life and feel, rather when you encounter rhythm and you encounter celebration, rather than feeling excitement and expansiveness and an opportunity to just be, instead we feel fear and retraction and the looping voices of inadequacy and self-doubt and stories. Like it is tragic that would be the experience you have this lifetime, truly. So, how do I inch people into this experience of dance? And I had mentioned to you, one is that I don't tend to use the word dance, because the word itself is what carries a lot of the weight. If I say like, oh, this is a dance class, I'm going to help us dance, we already might start to have feeling like resistance in some area of the body. I know even for me, if I'm going into a form that I don't know, when it has a name and I have an association with what that name means about me and my abilities, I'm already going to start to have some sort of contraction or retraction in my body. But if we don't really call it dance, and instead we just propose some of the ingredients that allow us to begin to land in our bodies, then that's one of the tremendous ways. And as you know, I do a lot of work with the floor. And the reason, many reasons why the floor. One, you mentioned that you've struggled with rhythm, and that is also a lot of us who did not grow up in a way where relationship to rhythm is an essential part of everyday life. Like we understand how things operate here because there is a rhythm. Like it's different. We know our daily rhythms, but we don't have this musical relationship to rhythm through the body. And when you're on the floor, it becomes a lot less important. Rhythm. Now that I bring rhythm into my teaching because I think it's very important. It's like something that eventually it's going to become, something that really holds you back in any movement pursuit, because ultimately rhythm, we have this, it's something that you're in response to sound, but also it speaks to coordination within your body, and it speaks to efficiency, because you can't be uncoordinated and you can't be inefficient and be really rhythmic. You can't. But the floor, rhythm, at least we can take that away. Like there's no need to step to the beat. There's no need to shift to the beat. Another is that it's a lot harder to look at what everyone else is doing and to be concerned about what everyone else is doing because you're laying on the ground. We have so much more feedback. Like our proprioception is heightened because there's so much of us in contact with the ground. And one of the ingredients for flow is that we feedback, like being able to get information about how we're doing is something that's very important for helping us land and stay focused. So when we have connection to something, usually it's just through the feet if we're standing up, and most people have grown up in shoes and the bottoms of their feet can't communicate. And they don't pick up sensitive sensations. And maybe they just don't even articulate in ways that they could really feel the ground. But when we lay on the ground, our whole body is able to pick up detailed information from the floor, which also means that we have something to continually return our focus to. When standing, if your attention has wandered, someone might invite you back into your some area of your body, but with the floor, we can keep returning our attention to how we're connected to the floor and what's happening at the level of contact. And as far as floor work goes, those are just a few of the reasons that I really like to bring people to the floor as an introduction to this experience of dancing, or to really why I consider is like continuous movement, continuous movement that's not based on mimicking what I'm doing. So non-mimicry based, non-choreographed, continuous movement.
So I love the idea of the floor, right? Because you're talking about essentially, well, I think one of the problems that we face is essentially people are kind of disembodied, right? Their map of their body and their connection of their body and their articulation and understanding of their body is limited. And we can very easily sort of occupy just our thinking mind. And so when we're trying to get people into movement, we want to get them in their body. We want to get them attuned to their body, recognizing the body. And what you're saying is that the floor essentially is sending a much stronger signal than standing on your feet. And a signal that is easier for someone to attune to than the signal of a beat, right? Mm-hmm. It's a beginning point to sensitizing the body.
Well, not everyone. People that didn't grow up with a deep relationship to rhythm, it is easier, but not for everyone, because if you've never been on the floor before, it's plenty awkward, right? Yeah. And you know, the interesting one of the interesting phenomena that happens is that people will tend to respond to meeting something hard with hardness in the body, rather than meeting something hard with softness in the body. And that's another thing that the floor teaches us, is how to release, how to let go, and how to meet something hard with softness, and to see how much more comfortable it suddenly becomes when you can dissolve the tensions. And it's you know, when you're laying on the ground, it's really unnecessary to continue to hold tension, because the ground is actually holding you, but we're in resistance to that. Applied to standing, it's quite the same. Like when you allow the ground to hold you, it's a lot easier to connect to rhythm. When we are in some ways like hovering ourselves from really connecting to the ground, it's very difficult to connect to the rhythm. We're not in the ground or in the earth enough to let sound travel up and down through the body.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have that I came to you with, 8 years ago, I think, is that what is the role of dancer in a broader movement culture? And if we look at movement as a necessary part, really, of self-cultivation, right? Something like parkour, it's like, well, you can escape a bad guy, you can chase somebody down, you can get out of the burn. Martial arts, you can fight somebody off. Being able to throw something, that's hunting, right? Why do we dance? Why do human beings dance? And why would someone who is looking to develop themselves, why would they want to bring this into that practice?
Well, I think we could look at this question more in terms of why have humans danced throughout history, which is a very different answer than why would someone who is trying to now formulate a movement practice that makes them a good model human mover incorporate or appropriate or somehow figure out how to include dance? It's a different answer, right? Like, historically, why are people dancing? Two main reasons. One, or I think I could say three main reasons. One is to transmit important information, cultural information. Here in Polynesia, many of the dances are about specific places. And it's not just a reverence for a place, it's actually to continue to tell the story of a place. And the gestures are how this place flows, how this place is cared for, how we as humans interact with this place. There's also dance in a more ecstatic form, which is get out of your head to heal, to set yourself free. So there's these dance forms that are, they're that's why I was saying it was really also embedded with story. The music, song, dance, story. They're not separate things. It's a thing that, and then this other form of dance that you'll see that, like I said, is ecstatic. It's to go to a different realm, to transmit the everyday experiences, to go and get lost. And when many people think of like, I finally got in the zone and I finally like found my flow, they're thinking a little bit more in that realm of like ecstatic movement. And then there's the purpose of helping people develop the coordinations that they need for everyday motions, like a replication of everyday movements used in like agriculture or even in fighting through dance. So it's a way to build coordination in relationship to your culture. And it can be taught to the children, and then people are prepared for what they will encounter. So similar to how play is preparing us for what we will encounter later on, these like dance experiences are also preparation for things that we will encounter through life. How many times have you heard of some phrase that where people need to learn to dance with the idea, or you're not really having fun with it until you're dancing, right? And that's metaphorical, but it's kind of real. Like until you can find this like joyous ease. I say another function of dance is that there was a health correlation. Like it was okay when it so happens that women who are moving their hips and stirring their hips in these patterns have much easier births, are more fertile. So the women do this dance because it's important for our culture that we carry on. And so there are dance forms that are also helping us do a physical practice that's good for our health and our community's health. So like those are all some of the more historical reasons, which is maybe it's the same, maybe it's different than if someone is like, why should I include dance in my practice?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that understanding the history of human physical practices is an important guide, right? Like, if people have always danced, then that's, it's like you're a person. You might want to consider doing the things that people have always. How do you treat your human? Well, humans have treated themselves with dancing for a long time. There's a couple. So I had a really interesting conversation with Simon Thakur about this, and we were talking about how great athletes often have dance backgrounds, and it's often kind of, the example that popped to mind is Israel Adesanya, who's the middleweight champion in the UFC right now. Apparently, he didn't train martial arts until he was 18 years old, but he was a hip hop dancer, and he walked into the gym, and a week after his first MMA class, took a fight, right, or his first kickboxing class, and then he was off and running. But there's something about the way that he moves. You can see him literally popping and locking as a way of creating illusions while he's fighting that allow him to manipulate his partner's perception, which is obviously huge in fighting. Mm-hmm. Fighting is very much about rhythm, right? It's very much about being able to establish a rhythm, break a rhythm, understand somebody else's rhythm, and learn to predict how they will move based off of that rhythm. So there's a deep interaction there. What occurred to me, what popped into my mind as you were talking about the cross-cultural context, is how much actually dance and song were integrated into work, right? And in these agrarian societies, when you're threshing the grain, you use a song and you use a rhythm in order to allow the work to become more efficient and allow it to be a communal event, right? And so dance isn't something that just happens at the festival. It's actually something that's weaved into the fabric of everyday life. When I was young, I was into Celtic stuff, and I studied Gaelic with the Seattle Gaelic Society, Shlin Gael. and we did walking songs. Walking is a Scottish term for basically smashing a tweed soaked in urine repetitively until it shrinks to the shape that you're looking for. And they have a whole litany. They have a huge song library around that. And then you could think of it as a dance, right? It's a physical task that they're doing, but it has a rhythm to it. And the rhythm is in response to music. And in order to do the task effectively, they're calling forth the music. And so when you talk about these cultures where rhythm is woven into daily life, like it actually had this really direct functionality of helping people organize work. Right now sea shanties are huge on TikTok. So I thought that was curious. But one thing that's interesting to me about that is that human beings, birds dance, right, for reproduction.
We're going to take a little walk. My internet is not liking us right here, but speaking of movement.
So I was very curious about that line of thinking about how song and music and dance are integral to actually just functional living in a lot of pre-modern contexts.
But is it limited to pre-modern contexts?
Well,
because here's one of the other things that I think now we exceed dance in theatrical context or like even on TV as representing some of the more painful emotions. Like these dances of heartbreak and mourning, and the dance fulfills all these functions, like whatever life transition or emotion needs to be expressed. That's something that can be expressed through dance. Emotion is a source of rhythm, right? An emotion or a feeling has a certain pulse. Like if we were all to pause right now, you might be able to identify like what the rhythm is right now for you. It might be your heartbeat. It might be the pace of your thoughts. But emotion carries a rhythm, but the one that people tend to have a lot of trouble accessing is joy. Can you access joy? Can you move as joy? I love to work with youthfulness as a prompt, as something to embody, as a question to ask myself and to ask other people why they're moving. How would you do this? Like if you felt youthful, how would you have done this in your youth? And it's amazing the shift that can happen for you in your movement, whether it's like joy, youthfulness, even maybe some of the qualities we associate with youthful movement, like, springiness, carefree, in lack of fear. Not holding on to stories about, oh, but this knee doesn't bend and my back doesn't go that way, not attached to stories, just moving. It's amazing what can shift with just like inviting one of those questions or one of those ideas. That's something that you cannot really cue someone into that state of ultimately ease and connection and celebration. So I think that's a very important function of dance, which you see in many African dance forms, that there's a clear joyousness and youthfulness that is integral to the dance forms. And that's something that many people haven't been able to access. They haven't felt safe accessing it. They don't know how, but I think it's just so essential. And how do you need to move? It could be incredibly simple, right? It could be bouncing. The simplest movement is often the best representation of like joy. It's certainly not being able to do crazy tricks and skills. It's not.
I'm struck, as you're talking about bouncing, I'm remembering my kids, right? 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and 3-year-old, right? And they're all in the living room. We basically turned our living room into a play space for them. And they turn on music and they do a lot of things, right? They're very acrobatic. But some of the times they're just bouncing. And I'd love to watch them bounce because their elasticity and their freedom of movement is really amazing. And it's amazing how, like, when they're in that playful dance space, their creativity and movement is outrageous, right? They just come up with stuff. Like my son did a cartwheel on a balance beam while dancing. It's not an easy skill.
Yeah.
Bouncing and twisting and vaulting things and doing acrobatics. So that capacity to tap into that youthful freedom, right? And there's something interesting about how self-conscious people are about dance, right? And how that is, in some sense, so contrary to the mind of a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like have you ever noticed that every child feels that they're very, very fast? Like they can all run really, really fast. If you're under 6 years old, you're the fastest 6-year-old on the planet, every single one. Right? Because their experience is dominated by their own perception of what it feels like to run. Right? When they run as fast as they can, it feels really fast. So therefore they're fast. And so they don't have a self-consciousness of what their jumping and dancing looks like to somebody else. So one of the things that's interesting to me about your teaching, it's funny, sometimes people give me a hard time about the fact that evolve move play isn't as playful as it might sound, right? Because I'm kind of a serious guy in a way, and I think very philosophically, and I like to, jump far and practice ways to hit people. But one thing that you do actually really beautifully is you bring a lot of goofiness to your movement. You play a lot of games, and you like to tap into some emotions that maybe aren't the emotions people associate with, say, modern dance. So, tell me a little bit about the role of goofiness in your teaching.
Yeah, that also ties back to a question you asked earlier about, kind of how we are welcoming people into this dance-like way of moving. And, one of the most powerful ways to help people feel safe, which we have to feel safe if we're going to move creatively or freely, we have to feel safe, is humor and silliness. And like, what a way to dissolve the egos in the room than to do something that is ridiculous, where there's not going to be a hierarchy of like, oh, well, somebody's arms going higher, they must be better. It is this dissolving of any idea about what should be happening right now. And I particularly in in-person environments like to surprise people and derail something that appears to be serious by changing it into something that's ridiculous. And I think that it's incredible to watch. If you go scanning the energies in the room, like, people that maybe they were, they're very prefrontal. They were thinking about the task. We're like doing a balancing exercise. And then through the combination of like what I'm asking them to do, what they begin doing, how they're interacting with someone else, it's like their energy becomes so much more spherical. Like the kind of like the joy of their kinesphere in the room is palpable, and like the whole room starts to kind of vibrate. And then from there, people are far more willing to engage with music and to go into something that's joyous or celebratory. So yeah, goofiness and youthfulness, very related. And if we were going to reduce it down to like, why is this good for us? Why would one be goofy and silly? What can I get out of that? I mean, you could think about how are the tissues of your body? How are you using elasticity? how is, if someone is an elastic mover versus like not an elastic mover, who's probably going to have more inflammation and pain? Probably the person who's not very elastic, because it turns out that when we're able to move in these like resilient and bouncy and rhythmic ways, like we not only get a lot of information about how our joints and tissues are doing, we are doing the very thing that tends to restore harmonious movement. So yeah, play and goofiness help people feel safe. It's important that we're not taking things too seriously, because I think that when we like, over intellectualize or make things too serious, it can block us from accessing our artistry. It can block us from being able to move through some things that we might not normally allow to move through us.
So could you give us some examples of games that you use to help people get comfortable with being ridiculous?
The tricky thing is that the best ones come up organically, always, because I have there's some games, right, and maybe in this conversation one will come to mind, but when it's prescriptive, it also loses the play, because my role as the teacher is to be playing with the people in the room. And so I have a plan of like, oh, here are some concepts that we're going to work on today. Here's a pattern that I think might really benefit these people. But my underlying motive is always like, how can I help them be here now? And how can I help them leave here in a way that will benefit the people they come in contact with? And for sure, when they have played and they have laughed, they're going to be, open, and that is contagious for the people around them. But something that when I said it happens organically, it might begin with a gesture that we're doing. Like if it's something as simple as like wrist circles, and we're trying to do a slow, controlled, articular rotation of the hands, and starting to layer in imagery of like that of what you are massaging. And this might turn into something where I'm taking them to different areas of the room, and through the images they're working with, it becomes ridiculous. Through asking people to begin to make sound, because we are so terrified of making sound in groups that is not words, then it starts to also, because it like tickles embarrassment. When we like lightly tickle the embarrassment for people, then it does actually start to help us loosen up. Sometimes the games arise from something strange that came out of my mouth. Like I say a word in a strange way that sounded particularly like a Southern accent. And then I begin to teach as this character, as this teacher who would tell you that you need to bend your knees when you bend over, because otherwise you might pull a hamstring. And as I go into this character, it determines what we're doing. And those sorts of exchanges are my favorite. So that, I think it's hard for me to answer this question in some ways, because of if play and games become prescriptive, they're not originating in play.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting point. And I think sometimes you can think from principles, and I do think it's useful to have structures, and then from those structures you freestyle. You always let go of the structure. I was listening to your interview with Kyle Finch, a mutual friend of ours, and one of the things you talked about, which I was not aware of, was the role of improv comedy in your approach. And it's funny because I talk a lot about the idea of like embodying courage, embodying virtue, and I often think that for a lot of people, physical courage is really, really valuable, but they need social courage, and there's only so much transfer between it. So I think a lot of these young men in particular who we work with who are socially inhibited, and they get some strength, they make their body beautiful, and then they're still socially inhibited. It's like, go to a Toastmasters class, go to an improv class, and then you'll take the next step, right? So I haven't done it though, and I thought it'd be such a powerful thing. Like as a coach, right? I feel like as a coach, having some good improv comedy would be such a powerful tool. So I was very curious when I heard you say that, and it sounds like it also connects maybe to this idea of how we set up the games, how we think about the games. So tell me a little bit about what improv comedy means to you and how it relates to the work that you do.
Yeah, I look at my relationship to improv as primarily as a super fan, because my experience in it was limited to classes I would take in New York City periodically, which though even just a session of improv comedy or several classes for many people can change your life. When you learn to yes and you actually successfully do it and stop fighting against your predetermined notions of how you want other people to behave, it is so powerful. But one of the beautiful things about living in New York City pre-pandemic was that the improv comedy venues, the shows were like $5. It's like the cheapest entertainment. And for me, like the most fulfilling kind of entertainment that I could be a part of. And that's kind of what it feels like when you're in the audience, rather than watching something that people have created and formulated and are now presenting to you. You are riveted because nobody knows what's about to happen. And to watch how the people on stage get involved with one another and bring their own life experiences into creating this never to be repeated, impossible to describe. And that's the really, a distinction maybe between like dance and improv comedy and like a workout. You could say, well, I did this many of this and I did this many reps and it was great. But like, you can't try to tell someone what happened in an improv comedy scene. It's impossible.
It's like parkour.
Yeah.
Like parkour is probably not as bad as improv, but it's along those lines, because generally, like most people, the way that we train parkour, you go out and you do what looks interesting, and you wander around until you find a jump or a line and it's interesting to you. And then later you'll be like, oh man, I had this great training session, especially if you're talking to like someone who doesn't do parkour and you want to describe, and you're so excited about what you did. It's the most awkward and completely useless conversation you can possibly have.
Right. Because not everything can be verbally articulated. And that's also why I think people need to experience it, because most of what we're doing is something that we can talk about and you can use words to help us understand it. But there's some things like dance that simply can't be transmitted, transcribed, notated in any way that does it justice. And if everything you're doing is something that you could really write down and understand, that's where I encourage you to find ways to do things that you cannot find words for. And at times relinquish the need to.
Yeah. I get really into the scientific side of practice, right? And so I want to be able
Which I appreciate about you.
And I always try to remind myself, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that is measured matters. And I think that that you're proposing almost an extension of that, right? Which is not everything that can be that matters can be articulated, right? And this gets into my whole conversation with John Viveki about propositional knowledge versus procedural, perspectival, and participatory. Like one of the things is a chance to enter into experiences that are inherently participatory. So you're like, there's no way to get propositional with it. So in some sense, when I ask you for the specific game, right, I'm asking you for a set of propositions that someone can take from this interview and go do. And you're saying, I can't give you the sensitivity and the experience and the perspective that I have. You have to come do it.
Yeah. Right. I can't give the game. I mean, I can give some pointers for being more receptive for the potential of a game. And if there, like I was saying, if there's gestures and actions in our movement practices, okay. If you're not watching the video, I'm kind of like swinging my arms as if I was like walking or running, though I'm seated, so what is this like? This is like walking and running, and what would make this walking and running abnormal in some way? Like what can we add to this scene? Because ultimately, like, we are people in a room, we're doing arm swings, which is some simulation of a real thing that happens in real life. But what would make this a little bit ridiculous, or what would prompt us to do it in a way that we probably haven't done it before? So I think it's I'm seeing often in creating games, the correlation between the mechanics of what is happening and real situations that people have experienced, and then adding layers of strangeness to it and an unfamiliarity that tends to get somewhat ridiculous at a certain point. And I know with Kyle, I was expressing how, turning the floor into like a trampoline, or turning the floor into a swimming pool. And now by itself, like, okay, that's fun. We could interact with this wall here and, pretend that it's covered in padding, like you're in a padded room, but we want to also be gentle. So we're throwing ourselves against the wall, slow motion, and seeing what happens. But as we add more and more ingredients to that scene of your own experience, then a game develops. So perhaps there is a pretty strong relationship between building a game and having a scene, because I have had plenty of experiences in movement classes and environments where, like, there's a game to be played, and it's tremendous for helping people land and flow and land in their bodies, right? We have to be very, very focused. We have to be engaged to play a game with another person, but it does often lack the freedom to, like, build on the game, transform the game into something else, and to frankly really be playful, right? Because we can play a game without being playful as a quality. I've even been scolded in a class before where we were playing some kind of like movement or rhythm game, and I took it, I went with it, and it was like, it's too much. No, tone it down, tone down all that fun you guys are having. There's too much of that in the world. So
it's a funny thing that happens in my seminars where I'll set up a game, right, and people will be playing the game, and they'll see me and they'll act apologetic about the way that they've added variation to the game. And I'm always like, how dare you play with the game, right, and you play seminar, I get where you're coming from. People are, it's interesting because I think that you need constraints to make a game work. Right? There has to be some direction, some orientation to the game, and then there has to be some kind of some sort of boundaries to the game. Otherwise, there's not enough structure and it falls apart. At the same time, once the boundaries and the constraints and the orientation are in place, the experience of being in play can be collapsed into just fulfilling the constraints, right? Mm-hmm. Soccer has a very clear motivational structure, has very clear goals. It's infinite because it can play out in any number of ways, and it's highly motivational. People all over play it. But I think anyone who's played a team sport for a long time and reached like a good level with it knows that sometimes they're playing playfully and they're enjoying the experience and it's highly rewarding, and sometimes they're grinding through the experience. And so there's a difference between playing and being in a state of playfulness. Mm-hmm. So, well, why would we be more concerned about the playfulness than the play? Like, it seems to me that you're more concerned about playfulness, right?
I'm not. Most of my classes are not ridiculous. Like this is a thing that shows up just like this spark that just so happens it's what people walk away remembering too. So it might be something that only takes up like 2 minutes of a 2-hour class. So I'm not more concerned with it, but I do build everything I teach with considering what is happening in the world and what can I propose, or what ingredients should I bring into this experience that I think will help the people in this room and how they show up out there. And playfulness is definitely important, and not taking ourselves so seriously, not being so attached to outcomes and measurable skill development that we can't find joy and pleasure in the present. So, and on that note, like pleasurable movement doesn't necessarily look playful, right? Many people look quite serious when they're doing something that is immensely pleasurable for them. So it's just an ingredient that's frequently missing. So I don't prioritize it over just play. And constraints often, for creative work in movement, very clear constraints tend to set people free. And when it's very specific and in many ways very narrow, we have the fastest learning. You cannot bend either leg while you do this exercise for a full minute, and then suddenly people really learn about their knees in a way that they never have before. So something very specific, very narrow, non-imaginative. It's like actually like a rather like mechanical prompt. I tend to work first with that like body position and body orientation, spatial orientation based restrictions, rather than imaginative and certainly not emotional restrictions, because those are tools for movement learning and accessing movement. It's certainly harder to grasp. But something came up for me when you were talking about like the importance of constraints in the game. There comes a point maybe where people are playing a game with constraints where it stops holding their attention. Mm-hmm. When it becomes like less engaging. Then I think an important question is like, what can you do to this game, to this experience, to help you really stay in it? Like, what little change do you need to make about how you're doing this and how you're engaging to keep it interesting to you, rather than abandoning it? Because our tendency, not just in movement, but in life, is when something loses, like it doesn't hold our full interest, that we like turn away from it, walk away from it, rather than staying with it and saying like, what's the little thing I need to do? You know what? I just need to move my hips more. Like that's for me often. If it's like I'm in a movement class and we're bouncing balls or something, like my attention starts to wander. Okay, I could make it more in my legs and in my hips, and suddenly you have my attention again, because I've relocated in my body and reestablished my connection to the space that I'm in.
Yeah, that's I think that need to renew practice, right? And to find like playful. One of the really beautiful short definitions of play is that it's repetition with variation, right? You do a task, you do whatever, and then I apologize for that. Had it on. Let me turn this on to airplane mode. Here's the problem with live. And we're back. So where was I?
Play. Repetition.
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed is, let's say I'm teaching people to do vaults in parkour, right? And they have one thing to go over and one thing to go under, and another thing to go over. And I say, okay, do that, right? And I'm very interested in effectiveness. Right? I'm trying to get them to recognize the most successful strategy for being able to do this flowingly and fast and powerfully and effectively, right? But if you just tell people go over, go under, go over, and you just give them space to do it, you don't give them lots more verbs, very quickly they will start adding variation. They will do it one way, especially if they have a higher level of physical competence. They're going to just start doing funky stuff, and they're going to have a lot of fun doing that funky stuff. It turns out that that's actually really good for motor learning, right? There's a lot of learning, not just in the motor system, but all these other systems are getting engaged. And that's play, right? That's play. And when we become static in our competence, at least, I don't think it's, where it's not changing a lot. If we don't have these ways of enlivening it, then we can easily lose interest. And then a little goofiness can be a really powerful tool. Another powerful tool can be just changing the constraints, right? Changing the game style.
A tool that comes up a lot in my work that often I hear the comment after, I've never felt myself so much, or I've never landed in my body so much. I can't believe I made it through that whole song and I wasn't thinking, was actually the use of extremely slow movement. It's, it's just a tempo that people rarely experience in life. Like it is a rhythm and a way of being that people rarely experience now. So to go super slow, and we could call it like sloth-like speed. I like to think of it as like, watching a candle melt speed. And my personal favorite is, when we watch something that's like a candle melting, we're actually watching something happen very slowly. But when we watch a high speed or slow motion footage of a high speed action, like an explosion or someone leaping, we see something very different, where you can really see the totality of someone's movement and how it is like every cell of their being is involved in this coordination. And what happens when we practice moving extremely slow, but with that level of connection throughout our movement, like with such a tremendous teaching tool, also helping people land in their bodies. And when you move slow enough, you're able to observe your impulses and not act on them, which is a big one for learning how to be more creative. Because if we follow our impulses, well, then you're just rehearsing patterns and patterns and patterns and doing the same, because you're going to have the impulse to do what you've done before, for the most part, unless you've trained yourself to have impulses to seek the things that you haven't done, right? But we can go, I'm feeling that I really want to continue reaching around my head right now. And rather than making a speedy, correction or adjustment, I'm going to change my trajectory and I'm going to choose to go somewhere else now. So I'm going slow enough that I can notice my habitual thought patterns, notice my movement impulses, gather data about how my joints are, really important information that we tend to not have space for in the tempo, and also the way that many people learn movement. A lot of mimicry, or in the context of dance, like choreography. I think choreography has its purpose, but it is one of the greatest faults of dance education in the last couple hundred years, Western culture, is that people learn dance through choreography. And you are kind of stupefying people. Like, you're not training them to really notice their own impulses. And that contributes to why many people say, I'm not a dancer, because it's hard for them to learn choreography. It's hard for them to make their form fit into someone else's forms and ideas. So,
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I always remember my first modern dance class, because I walked into an advanced modern dance class thinking that I was working in a beginner modern dance class. And the class was taught in blocks of 8 movement phrases, working up to a 36 movement choreograph over a course of, 2 hours. And luckily, a lot of it was groundwork. So my parkour background and play I'd done on the ground kind of held me in good stead, but the kicks and the spins and the jumps were pretty foreign to me. And it was one of the most humbling experiences that I'd had. I mean, which was, I was in a place where that was very intriguing. And I was like, okay, this is cool. But it did only last 6 weeks. So it was just too exhausting. But I mean, I think there's something really powerful about the memory capacity that's built there.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting to hear your critique of it as a barrier to the sensitivity that you view as like central to preparing even most from dance, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what does and I make a distinction between learning a movement pattern and pathway, and then learning like choreography or lengthy phrases. And I can't say, here's the point at which a small phrase or pathway becomes choreography in terms of the length of it. But I think it does have a lot to do with that in the individual's working memory with the content. Like as soon as you start giving me beyond what I can really remember, and my general feeling is that I am lost, it's not doing a lot of good. But also like we can experience different movement pathways by learning someone else's idea of a pathway. But overwhelmingly, the experience for adult movers who are interested in dance, which is primarily who I work with, is adults who did not grow up as dancers, who now have an interest in, dance or just fluid movement, like freer movement, is that their experience has been, I'd like to take a class. They go to a class and it's asking them to remember and memorize a lot. And, where does that put us? It puts us in our head. Which is not going to help us dance if it's the majority of the work in the dance class is being in your head and not gaining the tools to land in your body.
I feel like I want to say that I think there is some utility to it. For me, there was, because I feel like I learned to be able to remember without remembering. I couldn't possibly hold every piece of information about the movement in my mind. So what was really interesting about that experience for me was learning how to utilize moments in the movement as mnemonics for remembering the other pieces of the movement. Mm-hmm. It was like, I can't remember everything, but this tells me the information, which allows me to have like a small compressed version of that movement that expands the moment that I need it. And I thought that was a very interesting cognitive tool set to acquire.
Yeah. And it is. And you mentioned the utility, like it absolutely has utility. And it one of the, interesting things is that you were developing the ability to acquire patterns of movement, and you're working to then not still be thinking about them, to be able to kind of like ride the pathways that have been laid out throughout the course of this class until the point that you can just do it your own way. But my complaint is usually that the expectation is too large in the choreography, or it takes too much of a priority within many dance class contexts. Like there's a short, rather irrelevant warm up often, and then you have like, let's learn this really long routine, but maybe not so many tools to help people understand what would be natural for them to get to know their body. But going back to more historical uses of dance, like dance phrases that are passed between people, that is like choreography, though isn't called that, but like to say that it's a learned pattern of movement that we can perform together, we can perform alone. Someone could look at it and be like, oh, you're doing that dance. I learned that dance. Of course, it has symbolic value. It has, aesthetic value. I am often trying to help people deprioritize aesthetics in their own experience, or deprioritize their concern with aesthetics, because that's another thing that prevents them from landing in flow. Ultimately, if we're concerned about how we look, if we're concerned if we're doing it right, then where are we?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing I've noticed. I mean, my exposure to the dance world and through the series of classes, but then through a lot of people who I would say are at the intersection of movement, culture, whatever that means, and in dance. So that's you, that's Shira, that's Tom, that's Fighting Monkey, and I've gotten the feedback from, I think, all of you that you're trying to get away from an attention to aesthetics, that you're trying to achieve aesthetics through attention to something else, or not achieve aesthetics, which is interesting because I think for, like, often as generalists, we're coming to dance to find a sense of grace or an aesthetic or a line to our movement that's not going to necessarily emerge, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you might know Cosmo Dudley from scene, right? It's like you said, circus artists, they all dance to get aesthetics in their movement, right? It's like,
Yeah.
if you're a performing hand balancer, you train dance in order to have better aesthetics for your hand balance performance. So I'm curious how you see that relationship between the tyranny of aesthetics in some sense versus the utility of the aesthetics of dance for movers who come from another base.
Yeah.
So for a martial artist to think, how can I move more beautifully?
There's a lot there, because another tragedy has been when people say something is dance and something is not dance because it fits my beauty standards. Mm-hmm. And overwhelmingly, it has been dominant culture saying that, like, ballet and European derived dance forms have more value because they fit our beauty standards. And that is still, for many people, let's say circus artists or dancers, like, they're still, trying to form their body into some variation of the aesthetics that came from ballet. Now, I grew up doing ballet and I love it and it's beautiful. And when I watch it, and you watch someone who is a technician of this way of dancing, I see beauty and I see grace and I see something that I long for. Like, wow, to be so light, to have so much ease with your leg just flying up, and in the viewer, when we see that way of moving, it might also strike an emotional chord, because, like, when we see something that to us is beautiful, right, we often may feel something. And so people will often pursue dance, or, like, what, I would like my movement to be more beautiful, so let me study dance. But I think that, as you mentioned, your conversations with, like, Joseph and Fighting Monkey and Shira, that, like, there are ways to find aesthetic, not by focusing on the picture that it makes, and that is the connection that you have. I know when I'm watching someone move, the single thing that makes them most captivating is their attention to what they're doing. Because, like, ultimately, that's, like, the thing that is most captivating is, like, their, like, commitment and their attention when they're all in with what they're doing. And I can tell that they're really in that moment, rather replicating something or trying to form themselves into a cultural notion about what is beautiful. And of course, if you've trained moving a certain way, your body is going to fit the forms that you've trained as you move. But I think also the beauty of this is we have options. You could be extraordinarily aesthetically motivated mover with zero care about ever like freestyling or wanting to exclude a lot of positions from your movement, which is what we have. Because a lot of what aesthetics is that we're seeking something, but we're also excluding a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, in terms of like the consequence for the human, there's risk there. There's risk there because a lot of what we associate as like beautiful, and this is Western notions of beauty and dance, we are like avoiding the grotesque. We are avoiding that which looks particularly primitive, primal, earthen, phonic, like that which has the rawness or the emotions that we try to remove from our everyday life. Those, if we are like, oh, I don't want to access that in my dancing, who are you training yourself to be? I personally do both in my dance. Like people know me because I know how to put my body in positions that are widely considered pretty.
Yeah.
But I will not limit myself to those modes of expression because the reality is that when I do, I don't feel so good. I feel inflammation. I feel not as happy. I don't access joy as easily when I'm doing that. I am fulfilling some sort of, what I've practiced throughout my life, and people appreciate when I move that way, and I also enjoy it. But I certainly see the risks in having your identity tied to the aesthetics of what you produce over the experience and what the larger consequences are.
Mm-hmm. For some reason, what comes up for me is that just the idea of beauty in general, right? Like I think that within modern art and postmodern art, there's this idea of the death of beauty, and literature as well. And so there are, I'm appalled by modernist and postmodernist architecture. I think that it's absolutely destructive to the human spirit. And I think there's something very, very dangerous about that. But also there is this reality of a kind of a tyranny of beauty, right? My daughters have been praised for their appearance since they were very small, right? And so Audrey in particular, when she was really little, just like everybody's all like, you're the cutest little girl. She's so cute, just like all the time. And I wouldn't describe myself as like a particularly feminist person, but there was this thing in me that was like, I'm just not going to I'm not going to tell her that, right? I'm just going to I'm going to tell her all the other things that I love about her because she's just going to get it so much, right? And I just don't want that to be too weighted into her consciousness. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being beautiful or recognizing that some things are more beautiful than others, or wanting to pursue things that are beautiful. Mm-hmm. But when I think about my daughters in particular, what I think is I don't want them to ever have their beauty sorry, I'm struggling with the way that I describe this, but I don't want their body to be about what it presents to other people, not what that affords them to experience. Mm-hmm. I don't want them to walk through life seeing themselves as the object that is perceived by somebody else.
Yeah.
And that seems to connect to what you're saying, that when we focus too much on the aesthetics of how someone moves, What's getting lost is what is the value of the experience of having moved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you speak about your daughter, it's not only, not wanting the way she experiences her body and movement to be maybe structured by other people's views of like trying to fit into the notions of beauty. But it also, we carry those stories with us all the time. So even if we're not thinking about what other people think, we will still continue to hold ourselves back and maybe, maybe move in ways that are ultimately detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
There's the postures that are like encouraged, or like, I see it in strange places, like scapular protraction and elevation. One of the reasons that a lot of people that I work with don't have it is because they interpret those positions as ugly. They find it unattractive to raise your shoulder all the way up to your ear. That is a position that we avoid because that position looks like fill in the blank. And so what happens, there's a real consequence of what we allow ourselves to do, not just in our movement practices, but in our daily lives, because we're concerned about, what it symbolizes in terms of beauty. Like, is it beautiful or is it not? I'm teaching a course right now, and I was a rather large intake form, and the course is about inverting, like learning to go upside down, which for many people is a long challenge. And like it also carries a lot of emotional weight because it's something that people really want to be able to do. To get upside down, it means something. That's like one of the cool things you can do on a pole. But many people spoke about being afraid of like how they will look, failing or trying. And in particular, that was of concern for me because there is a strength requirement. There is a strength acquisition requirement to do many skills on the pole. And if we are afraid of what it looks like when we recruit our full strength, of like what it would look like to experience like full body irradiation, we block ourselves from being able to access our strength. And so it's related because the people are concerned about how it looks. That's tied to the cultural notions of beauty. And as a result, it's harming their range of motion and it's keeping them from being as strong as they can be, not just in the future, but even like right now, they can't access their strength. So
as soon as you talked about inversion, I was just thinking about a handstand. I was like, everyone loves to take pictures of handstands, but like if you think about traditional facial aesthetics, it's not the best way to present.
No.
And I can imagine that, like if you're a young woman who's or a young man, that's happening more in our culture now, but particularly this has been traditional for young women, right? And who is very concerned about her presentation of beauty, that the idea of being upside down on a pole, straining with one arm, and your face turning bright red and grimacing might be very off-putting, actually.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is that many people desire the skill, right, that requires like a huge amount of output and strength. They desire the skill, but they are afraid of looking and experiencing that level of like output or, and of course, at some point you don't look like that. I mean, if everybody who did cool tricks looked like they were turning purple and their veins were popping out of their forehead, I bet there would be less people who want to do that. Part of the appeal is when someone can do something hard and it appears to be easy. But right, what's part of the journey to making it easy is the phase that maybe we weren't broadcasting.
I always tell people, if you want to be the guy in the park or the girl in the park, attracting lots of attention for your beautiful aesthetic and cool tricks, you first have to be the guy in the park willing to fall down on your face in front of lots of people. There's no skipping that phase.
Which, that brings me to another thing of play, because some of my favorite movement experiences in my life have been where I've been falling over a lot like be kind of out of failure, but also, and it was so fun. Like there was a class that was in New York. It was called Breakbeat Gymnastics, where it was a b-boy who taught a class in the gymnastics gym that was breaking patterns, but on the gymnastics floor, which meant that you could fall over a lot and all the time. And it was so fun. And also now in pole, when I'm training and I kind of like mess up and let go and fall over a little bit, I find myself laughing and actually having like a really joyful session. Now the dangers, of course, pole's on a hard floor, and you don't want to just fall if you're in the air, and you need to know your body if you're going to test those limits, because there's like real potential consequences. But when in a lower stakes environment, I think that it's also really important that we do like practice you falling and moving through the positions that we are like afraid of being seen in, like to be falling over. And that's where, in like, okay, in many dance contexts, if you're in a warm up and you're doing a balance exercise, you're on demi point, releve, or on single leg, like you really don't want to be falling over, because you're good if you're perfectly balanced. And if you're the one who's wobbling, you're then less good, rather than being encouraged to find those limits. And actually, if looking for the places which you fall is something that you see more in like contemporary dance worlds, but that's actually like a small part of the dance world. So I try to help people be less afraid of looking silly.
That's it's a powerful thing. It's interesting because I don't know. I feel like I'm experiencing perhaps more empathy for some of the tyranny of the male gaze that people talk about, or I don't know if it's really male gaze, but tyranny of aesthetics. Because growing up where I grew up as a male, who's a very sort of hypermasculine, like the idea that my face probably looks really funny when I'm deadlifting something really heavy has never occurred to me as a potential inhibiting factor.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to imagine that like a lot of women are afraid to lift heavy weights. And, part of it is that like, I'll get bulky, right? So I'll be unattractive because of the lifting weights long-term. But I'm wondering if also it's really takes you out of the beauty just to do the thing.
Yes. I think that sure, people say, oh, I don't want to look like that person, which is a whole other topic. But I think that I don't want to look the way I will look doing the thing right now is also real. Like in terms of the efforting, like to look like you're efforting.
Veins
people
bulging
are
out.
afraid of it. Yeah.
Face
And I've been afraid of it in my life. Like there are certain places where I would feel safe looking those ways, and other places where I wouldn't feel as safe, and I'm more over that now, probably because I'm older, but it's unfortunate.
So I don't know, maybe this is a big can of worms, but I this morning before I talked to you, I was in conversation with John Vervaeke and Paul Vanderklay, who's a Christian Reformed church pastor. Part of the conversation was really about the idea of recovering the valuable aspects of Christianity, but also integrating them more effectively with some of the insights from Buddhism and Taoism and shamanic practices or indigenous world. And I'm thinking about ballet, and it's high, right? It's up, it's long, it's facially angelic, right? The facial expressions are a calm, beatific beauty, right? And how that seems to reflect a specifically Christian history of viewing the body as the antithesis of the spirit, right? And that it is by getting away from the body that we are able to approach heaven. And then to compare that to African dance, where the facial expressions are so much more variable show so much more of the earthiness of humanity, or the hip hop tradition, the stank face. I was thinking about your idea of, the things that were not allowed. Right? The O face is about as earthy and extreme a facial expression as you can make, right? Also, you could say one of the most beautiful and sacred moments that you can experience. But it's not something that conforms easily to, say, the aesthetics of ballet.
Right. Absolutely. The dance reflects the cultural ideals. In some forms, like the dance can even be like the propaganda of an ideal. Like, how can we like perpetuate and represent through movement on a stage and revere individuals for their ability to represent these ideals, which, exactly like you said, are ultimately getting away from the earth, representing sometimes they're like nymph-like, fairy-like, non-human, greater than human, but always away from the earth in terms of like how being on the toes, or how far can you get from being rooted, which is also what will taking away any of the symbolism. It just is, it's beautiful and captivating because it's unlike what we see in everyday life. And so it stands out when somebody can move their body in a way that is distinctly unlike things that we normally encounter. It catches our attention, whether that's someone balancing really proficiently on one hand, doing some crazy tricking, or like ballet, like, wow, that is not an everyday sight. And it's captivating. But it has been about like getting away from the earth. And in my growing up in dance, like, it's really important that your face doesn't look like you're straining or you're working hard, because as soon as you look like you're efforting or straining, it's no longer beautiful. And so as I moved into other movement experiences in my life, whether it be like trying a martial arts thing or something where I really needed my strength and power, if I'm afraid of showing effort in my face, how will that affect what I allow from my whole body? Right? The face is such a direct representation of really what we're feeling. And if we have to like kind of like keep it soft and keep our keep our face beautiful. But it's not just people like me who grow up in dance. That's the thing, is that it extends to those who haven't danced, and they feel like, well, I'm not a dancer because I don't look like that, and I look like this when I dance, so I'm not a dancer.
So you say martial arts, right? Like, when I punch around, like that grimace, that expression, all of that capacity to tap into aggression. I need that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The beatific expression. I'm not going to look like an angel when I hit you as hard as I can. But that
would be an interesting exercise.
Sure. But it strikes me that it goes deeper than that, right? Like, martial arts is a kind of a specific context, but the insight seems like it bleeds everywhere. Like, if you're taught to hold your face in a specific way, you're literally cutting yourself off from emotion, like,
Yes.
sexuality, right? If you're trying to have sex and you have to have a perfect ballet face during sex, I'm just going to say, I don't think you're going to be as successful at having an orgasm.
No, but absolutely. Trying to fit ourselves into beauty standards, or upholding them, or thinking that we derive our value from them, will inhibit you in all areas of life. Like, you can't really access pleasure and range of experience, right, when we're worried about how we look. If you're worried about how we look, and our worry about how we look is fitting into the beauty standards that we live in. So I try to blend it. Ultimately, like, as I said, people are drawn to me often because they think that what I do is beautiful. At least when I'm as the solo mover, rather than like my teaching in the classroom experience, they'll be drawn to me because they think what they do is beautiful. But it's very important to me to not to not place a value on like upholding, like, or not have people walk away thinking that they are more valuable if they are fitting into these aesthetics that I know how to transmit because I've learned them. I know how to shape yourself in a way and have the right negative space and the right angle of your face and your leg that people will say, wow, that's really beautiful. I know how to do that and I know how to transmit it, but it's also very important to me that that's not where people are putting the highest value. And the highest value is on their experience of being able to take care of themselves, to land in their body, and ultimately to feel safe in a room with other people, to connect with music. Those have to be a higher value for me.
I think that's the perfect place to stop. Unfortunately, that's what you're offering in some senses. You have achieved the standard of beauty. You can present it, and I think you don't need to reject the value of it, but also to recognize that value comes with costs.
Yeah.
And putting it as the number one thing without recognizing those costs and giving people ways to get outside them and to recover their own felt experience as primary. That's precisely the question that I had when everyone started praising the beauty of my daughter. It's like, cool. She can wear all the pretty dresses she wants. She can wear makeup. She can dance, as long as she doesn't let it take out her center in her own body and felt experience.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for
welcome.
I think that was a
Welcome.
really wonderful conversation. I look forward to future conversations. So I'm now like Rogan. I have a Jamie. Bobby, can you take us off live and we'll go to. So let me just explain for everyone who may be watching this right now that now we're going to do a Q&A, and this is just for people who are on our Podcast Plus membership. So if you're interested in joining us for future conversations, once a month we're going to be doing these live and sticking around to answer questions from the audience. Folks who are in our online academy get access to it. We're also just doing a special thing, so you can check in the description to get access to any of our upcoming calls. And this is going to be how we're going to support this podcast. And in addition to being part of the conversation, you also get to do Q&As that I'm going to answer at the end of the month and have a dedicated set of forums around movement to discuss these things and kind of take that discussion much deeper. So if you're interested in that, hit the links.